Welcome to Shaar HaYichud of the Mittler Rebbe, the Gate of Unity of the Holy Rabbi David Wolkenfeld of Lubavitch, where we're going to talk about the unity of God as it is expressed throughout all of creation. First, the Mittler Rebbe is going to connect the book that we're studying together now with another book that he wrote called Kuntres HaYispilus, the tract on excitement, where basically the Mittler Rebbe says that genuine excitement about godliness is dependent upon an analysis about how only God exists by looking at the analogies and explanations covered in this book, Shaar HaYichud, which considers that unity of God and how it's expressed throughout creation. So let's read that inside together. This is chapter 1, Perek Aleph. Hinei kvar muvor barichus bekuntrus meyuchad. It has already been explained at length in a particular pamphlet, Beprate ofne hahispilus b'moach v'leiv u'machshava shenolad min ha'yizbonanus, about the particular types of excitement in the mind, in the heart, and in thought, which result from analysis. Lefi seder he madregos naran chaychulu, according to the 5 layers of the soul, which are referred to as nefesh, ruach, neshama, chaya, yechida, etc. Now, later in this book, the Mittler Rebbe will explain that these 5 layers of the soul, correspond within the self to different faculties. So, for example, nefesh corresponds to the instincts or the gut emotions. Ruach corresponds to the heartfelt emotions. Neshama corresponds to the intellect. Chaya corresponds to the desire. And Yechida corresponds to the pleasure. So we'll talk about all of this in more depth later, but the bottom line here is that what drives this progressive revelation of our essence? The answer is analysis. Now the Mittler Rebbe is going to talk about what kind of analysis, and particularly it's going to be into God's unity like we talked about. Also, we have to understand the definition of this term analysis. So we keep using a term, but we actually have to cover the definition of the term. Now, it may seem self-understood. Usually when we think of analysis, we think of in-depth or detailed study, but it always helps to contrast something with its opposite to clarify the unique definition of the term. So we'll actually make a contrast between analytic study and more surface or cursory study. Here we go. Vihine, mahus hahisbonanus be'etzem. Now the essential definition of the term hisbonanus, analysis, Hu inyan hayistaklus hachazaka ba'amkus ha'inyan, refers to gazing strongly into the depth of a matter. Of course, here when we say gazing, we're using that word figuratively, and we mean seriously considering something intellectually. V'lamod alav harbein, to stand on it very much. Until we understand it clearly with all of its most minute details. And this is making use of the inner faculty of understanding. And just to hop back for 60 seconds and give you context to appreciate that, that comment of the Mittler Rebbe here, the Mittler Rebbe's student, Rabbi Hillel Paritcher, explains in his commentary on this book that we can apply our mind, in generally speaking, to on 3 levels. We can consider what something is and how it works. That's like consider the intellect of the intellect. We could then, once we have a clear definition of of some term, we can then ask questions about, is this thing good or bad, right or wrong, permitted, forbidden? That's considered the emotions of the intellect. And then we can think about how we can apply it, which would be like the gut emotions or the instincts of the intellect. So for example, we could ask the question, what is the definition of a Holocaust museum? Okay, then we could give a whole definition, maybe on paper. Then once we've clarified that, we can ask, is this a good thing or a bad thing to build? So we may say, okay, it's a good thing to have one of these in the community. Okay, then we could think about, so how are we going to make this happen, right? Questions about implementation in logistics. So when the Mittler Rebbe speaks here of the inner aspect of the intellect, he's talking about what Rabbi Hillel Paritcher labels intellect of intellect, meaning just understanding what something is and how it works, kind of like a scientist, just looking at questions of definition and mechanics. Okay, this process of analysis makes use of the inner aspect of Bina, Hanikra Balashon Hagamara B'Shem Iyun, which is called in Talmudic language by the term Iyun, analysis. So what we call in Kabbalah and Chassidus, Hisbonenus, that term is synonymous with the term used in Talmudic language for in-depth study, which is the term Iyun. They mean the same thing. Kamosha Amar b'Maseches Sukkah, like it says in Tractate Sukkah, in the Talmud, Ha lamagares v'ha le'iyune. There is girsa, surface study, and there is iyun, or analytic study. Okay, so the Talmud there is describing two opposite methods of studying information. We can study things in a cursory fashion, just to cover ground. We can study things in an analytic way, in depth, which many times entails pause and restraint. And that's exactly what we're going to learn here inside now by the Mittler Rebbe himself, who will also give us a simple analogy to compare these two kinds of study from situations in life we may have come across before and can therefore relate to more easily. Okay, first the definition of the terms, then the analogy. So Perush HaGirsa, who the definition of Girsa, or cursory study, is Rak Havanas Hadavra Ba'ashkafa Rishona, Sheholechas V'noves B'mihirus Bilti Ikuv V'ha'amada Klal. So the definition of Girsa study is just understanding something at a first glance. And this kind of study is characterized by going and flowing rapidly over the information without really stopping to consider it more seriously at all. Now again, we wouldn't want to discount this type of study. It has its advantages. Certainly getting a general overview of some topic we're studying is beneficial. Okay, but again, we're going to see that there's some limitations implied by study that is limited to this superficial, the superficial method of study alone. Kiyaduaz is no derech mashal. This is by way of analogy, analogous to hamabid be'eno al davar ma, someone who looks at something with their eyes. So now we're turning our attention more from the point we're actually discussing, which is the intellect and intellectually considering something, and turning to the analogy of someone looking at something, right? The eyes are also a source of perception, albeit for tangible things, as opposed to, let's say, intangible things we perceive with our mind. So now we're considering someone who's looking at something just in a passing sort of a way. Ve'eno misponen klal ala davar be'echuso umahuso b'kol chalakav hapnimim v'chitzonim, and they do not at all contemplate this matter. In other words, that they're looking at with their eyes to understand what it is and how it works with all its inner and outer parts. Rak derech ma'avir ba'alma, but rather they look at this thing just in a passing sort of a way. Well, unfortunately, like we just said, there are going to be some limitations implied by this superficial view. There are limitations both at the time of observation, or at least close to the time of observation, and there's also a limitation when you consider their grasp of what they looked at over time. And the basic cause for both of these is the fact that they did not consider the details of what they looked at, and therefore their perception, and by extension their understanding and absorption of whatever they observed, is more superficial. It's less lasting, if you will. Here we go. So, Shebameshach Zaman Vada Yishkach Alav Lagamre. Over the course of time, they will certainly forget what they observe completely. V'gam lo yuchal l'saper lezulaso, Raklalius inyan oso hadavar shara'a baha'avaras ayin velo bitvius ayin klal. And even at the time, in other words, close to the time that they observed it, I injected those words, the words close to time, but I believe that's what the time frame that Mittler Rebbe is discussing here. Even at the time, they will not be able to communicate to someone else what they observed, except in a general way, because they observed it themselves in a general, superficial way. Now that was the analogy, okay, looking at something tangible. Now let's hop back to our original discussion where we're talking about the mind. Let's say maybe our own mind or the mind of a student studying some subject. Here we go. V'kein ha'avaras ayin ha'seichel be'eza svara b'hashkafa rishona bilti iku v'hamada la'ayin bohetav. And the same applies to the eye of the mind, the intellect, which considers some explanation merely in a superficial sense. V'lo bitvius ayin klal. V'hamada la'ayin bohetav. Without really standing on it and analyzing it well, to know this explanation in a serious and an in-depth way. The result of that superficial study is that a person will not grasp the depth of that subject at all. Period. There is no other way. It's not possible. That's what the Mittler Rebbe is explaining here, to consider something superficially and at the same time mysteriously grasp its depth. It doesn't work that way. The details, the inner workings of the concept need to be understood clearly in order to grasp its depth. So the question is, okay, so now we had that simple statement by the Mittler Rebbe that this is the fact, this is the way it works. But the real question, I think, after that is, why does it work this way? Let's get some explanations for these simple statements. And so the Mittler Rebbe now begins the explanation of how this works. Like, in other words, the inner workings of the mind and why it is the case that we need to grasp the details of something in order to understand it to its depth. And the Mittler Rebbe is now going to explain that there's three general faculties of the mind, which are referred to as Chachma, Bina, and Das, which would translate respectively to insight, understanding, and knowledge or awareness. Really, Das means a type of awareness gained through a deep connection to the concept, meaning when a person feels a personal interest in the subject that they're studying, for example. And also, as we'll talk about later, knowledge that they can gain through experience in certain ways, most prominently. So let's dive right into it. Ki hine gimel devarim hu sheyesh b'kol davar muskal. There is in every concept three aspects, and their names are omek, ve'orech, ve'rochev. The depth, and the length, and the width. Now, of course, we're speaking figuratively here, and therefore we have to take these terms and understand them in the context of these three general aspects of the mind. And now the Mittler Rebbe is going to take these terms, term by term, and explain their definition and give an analogy that we can understand. Harochev hu hesber hamuskal lakol tzad bepratim harbe kerochev hanar v'lo dvarm kahavyasan levad kanahar katzar. The width is the aspect of the explanation of the concept to every side, meaning the details of the concept, which is comparable to a wide river, as opposed to considering the concept from one angle alone, from one side alone, as it were, which is comparable to a narrow river. So you have a wide expanse of river, where the water is spreading out to the sides of, let's say, the depth, and then you have a very narrow river where the water is really kind of restricted to a certain space and not really moving past that in the context of a river. Let's just hop back to what we're actually talking about. When you have the depth of a subject, you have some concept, let's say you can consider it many times from multiple angles, because most concepts are multifaceted. That would be considered breadth, someone who has a broad understanding of some subject, as opposed to somebody who either is incapable or else perhaps refuses to consider a concept from more than one angle, and maintains a very narrow view of that concept. Many times you hear such people referred to as narrow-minded individuals, right? So that is a little intro to the three aspects of the mind. Well, let's hop all the way back and just summarize what we learned here. We learned that the purpose of studying this book is in order to clearly understand how only God exists, which in turn is going to drive the revelation of our essence, level by level, which is synonymous with saying deepen our relationship with God step by step. Okay, so the ultimate point of this book, to deepen our relationship with God. How? By expressing our essence. What drives that process? Understanding how only God exists. What does that begin with? An understanding of the method of study, which is called hisbonenus. Hisbonenus means analysis. Analysis entails understanding the inner and outer parts of whatever we're studying. Okay, this is universal. It doesn't just apply to this subject. That process, that methodology really applies to any subject. But here we're looking at it in this context, of course. Then we're going to begin understanding why that is the case by considering the inner workings of the intellect. The intellect has three general aspects, which, as we said, outside are insight, understanding, and knowledge, but the Mittler Rebbe is referring to these aspects here by the terms depth, length, and width. We began by first describing the width, which refers to the details that define a subject, and the understanding of which broadens one's understanding of that subject or of that concept. In our next class, we'll pick up with length, depth, and tie it all together to understand the relationship between them, and that will answer our original question about why this process works the way that it does. Thank you for joining.